Canada has long been viewed as a global leader when it comes to welcoming newcomers and building a stronger, more diverse society. But with housing affordability hitting crisis levels, public systems under growing strain, and public opinion shifting quickly, Canada's immigration strategy is now going through a major reset. In this new policy direction, the government is set to reduce both permanent and temporary immigration targets over the next stretch of years. Critics say the changes could disrupt the lives of thousands, especially people currently in Canada on temporary status, by limiting pathways to stay long-term. In this video, we break down the key points of the updated rules for 2026, explain why the government says the shift is necessary, and examine what it could mean for Canada's social, economic, and political future. So, here is the list of the new immigration rules that could make millions leave Canada in 2026. Before we start, make sure you subscribe to the channel and comment your thoughts. Here we go. Number 1. A turning point in Canadian immigration policy. For years, Canada's immigration system has been praised for its openness and for the role it plays in strengthening the economy and supporting population growth. After the pandemic, the government boosted immigration levels to help with labor shortages and support economic recovery. But as the rebound continued, evidence mounted that the pace of growth was creating pressure, especially on housing availability, healthcare capacity, and other everyday services Canadians rely on. At the same time, more people began to express frustration, with public conversations increasingly framed around the idea that immigration levels are becoming harder to manage. In response, the government has introduced a revised plan for 2026 to 2028 that reduces the number of newcomers allowed into Canada. Importantly, the reforms are not only aimed at permanent residents, but also at temporary residents, such as international students and foreign workers. The government argues these changes are meant to create a more controlled and sustainable system. However, critics warn that without clearer, fair pathways to permanent status, many people who have built their futures in Canada could be left stuck on temporary permits, or forced to return home when those permits end. Number 2. Tightening permanent resident targets. One of the most noticeable elements of the new direction is a reduction in permanent resident targets. Under earlier planning, Canada had outlined high annual goals for welcoming new permanent residents. Numbers that signaled an aggressive long-term expansion strategy. But the updated plan now calls for 395,000 new permanent residents in 2026. 380,000 in 2027. 365,000 in 2028. That is a major cut compared to what had been previously projected. The government says the rollback is tied to mounting pressure from rising housing costs, overwhelmed public services, and public concerns that the country is already under strain. From an economic standpoint, the idea is that lower immigration inflows could ease demand on the housing market and help ensure that major services, like healthcare, education, and transportation, can keep up with Canadians' needs. But opponents argue this approach can ignore a reality faced by people already inside the country on temporary visas, many of whom were counting on a stable transition into permanent residency. If temporary residents can't move forward, the reforms risk creating a gap. People who want to stay may not be able to, even if they're contributing to communities and the economy today. Number 3. Reining in temporary residents. Even more impactful than permanent resident targets are the updates directed at temporary residents. Canada's temporary population, made up of international students, temporary foreign workers, and other visa holders, has grown rapidly in recent years. The updated policy aims to reduce the share of temporary residents in Canada over time. The government's projection is that temporary resident arrivals would drop significantly across the 2026 to 2027 period, with a partial rebound in the following year. This is designed to encourage a transition rather than indefinite temporary stays. The expectation, according to the logic of the policy, is that many temporary residents would either move into permanent status through established pathways or leave the country when their permits expire. The government also points to changes involving work permits, especially through programs that historically allowed higher volumes of hires. At the same time, the policy introduces tighter conditions around international student study permits, including reduced room for approvals and stricter eligibility requirements. For many international students, the concern is clear: if the rules narrow the path to later permanent residency, some may find themselves unable to secure long-term status. Even after investing years in Canadian education and building ties to the country. Number 4. Express entry reforms: no more extra points for job offers. Express entry has long been the central pathway for many economic immigration applicants. In this points-based system, candidates compete using a comprehensive ranking system that evaluates language ability, education, work experience, and other factors. For years, job offers could add a significant scoring boost for eligible candidates. But one of the controversial parts of the new plan is the removal of additional points tied to having a valid job offer. Under the revised rules for 2026, candidates in the express entry pool would no longer receive the extra points previously available for job offers. The government's stated rationale is to reduce fraud and protect the integrity of the process, especially concerns that some job offers may not reflect genuine hiring needs or may be manipulated through questionable arrangements. Critics respond with a different worry: removing those points could lower many candidates' overall ranking scores, reducing invitations, and making it harder for applicants who rely on job offers to compete successfully. And for people already living in Canada on temporary status, that could mean an even narrower path to permanent residence, potentially increasing the pressure to leave when permits expire. Number 5. Overhauls in the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. The Temporary Foreign Worker Program has faced repeated debate and scrutiny. Supporters say it helps fill labor shortages in a timely way. But critics argue that it can also contribute to exploitation when workers are tied to restrictive conditions or employers have too much leverage. As a result, the updated policy introduces tighter controls, especially for lower wage categories. Key updates include shortening work permit durations for some low-wage positions, reducing the maximum time allowed on certain permits. Stricter eligibility expectations for employers, including tighter enforcement for hiring through specific programs. Additional limitations in areas where unemployment rates are higher and where the government believes local labor supply should be considered first. The government frames these changes as necessary to reduce unfair labor practices and better protect workers. But critics warn that if transition options to permanent status become limited, some temporary workers may end up in a difficult position, either remaining temporarily without stability or being forced to leave if they cannot secure long-term residency. Prime Minister Trudeau has acknowledged that the government did not fully balance labor needs with managing population growth during the recovery period. On the political side, opposition leaders have used the issue to challenge the credibility of the current approach. They argue that immigration policy has contributed to higher housing costs and increased pressure on services, and they promise alternative strategies, including linking population growth to housing construction. Meanwhile, business groups and some economists caution that reducing immigration, especially for the long run, could create new challenges by limiting the labor pool Canada depends on for economic growth and innovation. Canada's aging population and low fertility rates mean immigration remains a key mechanism for sustaining labor supply. So the reforms become a double-edged sword, aimed at managing domestic pressures, but potentially creating long-term risks for competitiveness. Number 8. Forcing millions to leave, what does it mean? The claim that new immigration rules could force millions to leave Canada is intentionally provocative and complicated. It does not necessarily mean mass deportations of settled residents. Instead, the idea centers on temporary residents whose permits may not convert easily into permanent status. With tightened caps, reduced targets, and stricter criteria, temporary residents who cannot meet the new expectations may find themselves with no realistic pathway to stay when their permits end. That could include people who previously believed they were on track to transition through established routes. There is also concern about increased visa scrutiny at ports of entry and stronger enforcement tied to compliance. For some students and workers, even minor misunderstandings could become high-stakes issues. Critics argue the result could be a system where people who have already contributed, paying taxes, learning skills, and integrating into communities. Socially, temporary residents who had planned their futures around the expectation of transitioning to permanence may experience abrupt disruption. Politically, the reforms could also reshape Canada's debate landscape for years, especially if housing affordability and public service capacity continue to dominate voters' concerns. Number 11. Looking ahead, navigating a changing landscape. As Canada enters this new era of immigration management, both policymakers and stakeholders face an uncertain future. These reforms are not just page-by-page policy adjustments, they affect real people living in Canada right now. For temporary residents, the message is that the pathway to permanence is getting narrower. Without meeting the new and stricter expectations, many could be left with no option but to depart after their permits expire. Employers will also face pressure to adjust to a smaller potential labor pool. And politicians must manage a divided public environment, balancing the desire for economic growth with the demand for social stability. There is still hope, according to some advocates. A more controlled system could ultimately improve integration outcomes if Canada invests in the infrastructure and services needed to support newcomers effectively. But achieving that will require more than targets. It will require real commitment to housing, settlement supports, and public capacity. For many, the stakes are personal. The promise of permanent residency and citizenship has been a lifeline for individuals seeking a better life. Now, with changes to targets and stricter criteria, that promise may feel less secure for people who have already built their futures in Canada. The conclusion. So guys, this was the list of the new immigration rules that could make millions leave Canada in 2026. Hope you liked it and appreciate it. Canada's updated immigration direction for 2026 represents a sharp departure from the previous high-volume approach. By reducing permanent resident numbers and tightening temporary resident pathways, the government says the aim is to reduce strain on housing, healthcare, and critical services. But these changes come with a cost, especially for those currently living in Canada on temporary status. The next few years will test whether the reforms can achieve the controlled and sustainable promise without sacrificing long-term stability for people who have already integrated into Canadian life. As Canada moves through this transition, all eyes will be on whether the policy strikes the right balance between economic necessity and social sustainability, or whether, as some critics fear, it will push people out of the country they hope to call home. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon for the latest upcoming videos. Bye bye, see you.